So with a continued success, John, I understand you went into owning and breeding to a certain extent.
Yes, I did. Yeah, I was always interested in possibly owning and particularly breeding side of it. I was interested in the pedigrees, developed a strong interest in the pedigrees. And by this stage I was fortunate enough to have a pretty decent clientele up and down the country. And one of my customers was Mick Shannon, who at that time didn't have a licence. Mick, he was still actually towards his very end of his playing career, and he was similarly minded. He was very interested in pedigrees and very interested in owning and breeding. So he came to me with a sort of a proposition that three of us go into partnership. That was Mick, myself, and another bookie called Peter Jolliffe from Bournemouth, another very nice chap and a great character. We went into business in a small way to buy mares, one or two mares, and see if we could breed anything worth talking about. And we decided that we would keep the female offspring that we bred to race, but we would sell the male offspring with a view to that helping with the ongoing financing of the operation. Bearing in mind we were at a low level, we were competing with Sheikh Mohammed, but on a shoestring, so to speak. But because Mick was very, very good at all aspects of bloodstock, and we left the buying mainly to Mick, and we kicked off with two mares, one of which was Falls of Laura, which John Dunlop had trained in her racing days, and we bought her in foal to Castle Keep, and the first produce from that pregnancy was You Know the Rules, who I named actually because I developed a habit on the rails of being a bit rumbustious with people and reminding them, you know the rules. So that's how she got that name, and she was very, very successful for us. I think she won 8 races. It didn't start well, but it certainly improved and ended well. And she got beaten in 2 cellars as a 2-year-old. She went from getting beaten in 2 cellars to winning the richest 1.25 mile handicap in the calendar, which was the Hong Kong Jockey Club handicap at Sandown. And she also won a listed race at Doncaster on St Leger Day with Leicester riding, and she then finished off running on Arc Day in France in the Prix-Opera. So we had a lot of fun with her for a very little outlay, and that's what got me into owning horses. And then shortly after You Know the Rules was born, when she was a yearling, that was when she was a 2-year-old, that was when Mick took the trainer's licence out. I didn't want him to take a trainer's licence out because I liked the setup of the breeding, and Mick had some good premises down near Southampton where he had boxes and an indoor American barn, and I wanted him to stay as an owner breeder rather than go into training that I thought was fraught with pitfalls. But he obviously made a fantastic job of that as well. We started with You Know the Rules. It was good for us, and then later I owned some others, flat horses and jumpers. But I really liked the breeding and studying those extended pedigrees, and I was lucky with jumpers because Brendan Powell picked the jumpers for me, really. Brendan was good at finding reasonable priced jumpers, and I'd mentioned to Brendan that I was interested maybe a jumper or two, and at the time we just started riding one or two horses for Bob Buckler down in Dorset, and we decided that we'd try and find something for Bob to train. And Brendan identified a horse that had some ability, German bred, but it had some problems with its tendons, and it had the carbon fibre implants, which can be a successful operation, but you need patience with it. And the previous owners who had the carbon fibre implant operation had been too much of a rush to get it back to the track, causing it to break down again, and therefore they wanted rid of it. Although it had ability, they just wanted it out the way. So they sent it to Ascot Sales, and Brendan said, "Oh, I think you should buy it." So I said, "Well, okay, don't go too mad on with the price, you know." So I left it to Brendan, and he rang me in the car and said, "I bought that horse." I said, "Oh, well, how much is it?" He said 17. I said, "Oh, 17,000. I said, "I didn't really want to go that high, really." He said, "No, 1,700. So I was relieved straight away. So we sent it down to Bob Buckler, and that, of course, was Angelo's double. And he turned into a very useful hurdler on his day. He had to have soft or heavy ground. Soft ground he was okay on, but heavy ground he was really good. And he won his second race back. He won by a distance, really. I think it was 30 lengths, I think was the official distance. He won at Lingfield in a novice hurdle. And he then became a useful handicap hurdler over 2.5 miles. He won the big handicap hurdle at Kempton day after Boxing Day. He then became favourite for the Coral Cup at the festival meeting, because he would have had to have had the heavy or the soft ground, and in the event it didn't materialise because he got a small injury again shortly before the race. He was unable to run, so then we switched him to fences. And again, he wasn't bad, but he wasn't a natural over fences. But he still won some decent races, including again at Kempton, Boxing Day or the day after that meeting. He won I think it'd be a Grade 2 race now, novice chase. So he was a good servant all round. Won 5 or 6 races for little money. But my interest was always that breeding and the pedigrees, and that's what I tend to look at now most of all. And it's still possible to buy cheap horses or cheap mares if you're prepared to gamble, particularly if they're staying bred, because the accent now is always on the speed and the speed stallions, etc. And I'm always the opposite. I'm always looking for the stouter bred, the stayers from the old-fashioned families, the sort of Jim Joel type families and this sort of thing. But one thing I do feel strongly about, I think it's time for the whip to be banned completely. I think that racing generally is under pressure from various of these focus groups and the RSPCA, etc., that are always looking for an excuse to come criticise horse racing. And I think the time has come to ban the whip completely. And I know that John Franklin thinks it should be banned, and I certainly think it should be banned. And I'm not by no means convinced that horses run any faster for it. It seemed to me in this year's Grand National, with the second Pleasant Company, seemed to run faster for the last 200 or 300 yards when the jockey stopped the whip and rode it hands and heels. And a couple of things stick in my mind about the whip. Many years ago, I think it was the first year I ever made a book at Cheltenham on the rails, there was an unknown trainer called Martin Pipe, had a horse in the Triumph Hurdle. I'd never heard of him, but I'd certainly heard of the favourite, a horse called Broadsword. and Broadside was ridden by Peter Scudamore, and I started laying this horse, and anyway, it never stopped shortening up, and I stood it for far too much money. I'd have been in trouble if it had won, and it came to the last hurdle full of running, looking all over the winner, and just before the last hurdle, the horse that was challenging it was a grey ridden by Paul Leach, trained by Martin Pipe, called Baron Blakeney, and he dropped his whip. And they jumped the last. Now bear in mind that Broadsword by this stage was about was a shortish price favourite. Baron Blakeney was 66-1, and as they went up the running, all that Paul Leach could do was get hold of its mane and sort of ride it in that sort of almost a cowboy fashion, and it outran the favourite and beat the favourite on the line. Which always stuck in my mind. He won without the whip up that hill at Cheltenham, at the same time putting Martin Pipe on the map. And the other occasion, going back to the rules that I owned with Mick and Peter Jolliffe, she was due to run at Goodwood, and I always like to have plenty to do with the jockey bookings, and Alan Munro had recently won the Derby on Generous and was looking a good jockey, and Pat Henry, who we were going to get, it was at another meeting, so we got Alan Munro to ride her, and she was in a competitive mile or mile and a quarter handicap at Goodwood, and although she was one of the front pins in the betting, it looked a very competitive race. Anyway, to cut a story short, Alan Munro, about a furlong and a half out, she was looking quite she was looking quite threatening, like she could win, and just he started to ride her towards the front, I saw the whip go flying up in the air. So that's a good start. Anyway, she ran away and won 6 lengths under Alan Munro. She won a competitive handicap by 6 lengths, and he dropped his whip, and I went down the track and picked the whip up. Took it back to the weighing room for him. So I'm not at all convinced that horses run fast for the whip in any event. And I'm not a jockey, and I'll be the first to admit that someone could accuse me of not knowing what I'm talking around. But I've seen enough races to know that I think there are plenty of horses that would run faster. And despite notwithstanding that, I feel that it's time for racing to try and put on a face to show to the rest of the world, the outside world, that it is taking into account the feelings of some of these groups, the RSPCA and some of the other people, and to say that we're going to address it rather than be forced to address it, and we're going to ban the whip. And I don't think racing would be the horse racing would be any of the more poorer or any of the less competitive for it. In actual fact, it could encourage better jockeyship, because they won't be able to use the whip. They'll have to find other devices to make the horses run to their best. That's my opinion, and I'm sure it'll be contentious, and I'm sure there'll be plenty of jockeys that disagree and trainers. But that's my view for what it's worth.
Right, John, you're betting on the rails, where it used to be extremely lively, even though I could see from the back rows where I used to be with my bosses. Were there any punters that you used to have to try and dodge and duck that you respected? Yeah,
most of them. My clientele was made up largely of owners, trainers, trade, people that might well know more than I did. So the truth of it was, most of my clientele knew what they were doing. Ladbrokes had a very strong card, used to back horses most races. They didn't back too many non-triers. Likewise Hills and Corals, although they were less active. And then I don't know where to start really. Barney Curley, Michael Tabor, or Victor Chandler as a punter, another fellow bookmaker who I liked a lot, but he was also a big punter. Derek Smith, Ladbrokes, they all bet with me, and they were all obviously difficult to beat, but I liked them all, and I never closed accounts. So I took a sort of completely different view to the one that sort of reigns these days. I never closed anybody's account for winning. I would only close their account if they irritated me or I didn't like them. But generally speaking, I never closed accounts because anybody won. I considered that it was my job to find a way to handle that sort of money. And I'd started off working for William Hill, and he sort of found a way to handle it. So I thought that I would. So yeah, Barney was always very, very difficult to beat indeed, to the point where he almost, if he had a bet, one of his own horses, it was just a question of getting the money together, you know. And he did a very clever thing one day at Sandown Park with the horse. I can't quite remember the name of it, but Declan Murphy rode it. And Barney had worked out that if there was no money for his horses, close to the off, the price would drift, because the bookies would start to get the smell that maybe this one wasn't being backed. So Barney said to Declan Murphy, "Can you delay the start for 1 minute?" Declan said yes. They took the horse to the start and found an excuse down there to delay the start for the required minute, which of course was all Barney needed, because the off-time approach, the bookies now haven't seen a penny of Barney's money come to light, and now the price starts to get extended. And as it did so, of course, in that interim minute, in stepped Barney, back to it all the rails bookmakers, and it needless to say, it won the length of the straight, which was the usual routine with the horses that Barney had backed. Some of them were decent horses, and he was obviously a good trainer, and I liked Barney. He was very entertaining, and I used to socialise with Barney at that time, and we'd often meet in the Victoria Club Casino, where Barney liked to play punter banco. Michael Tabor was always a fearsome character. I liked him as well a lot. Michael was a very interesting guy, come from lowly beginnings, but he was an extremely big gambler, and he also knew plenty of tricks. But I liked Michael because his money and his settling was always good. You didn't have to worry about whether you were going to get paid. The same goes for all those guys, really. They were all such good. They were all very good at it, and you had to give all of them the maximum respect. Derek Smith was getting a good card via Ladbrokes connections. Michael would ferret around and use 2 or 3 good form judges, as well as a few jockeys and trainers, and they were all pretty difficult to beat. But somehow or other, I managed to survive. I mean, I don't know how sometimes, but every day was interesting. There were other big punters as well as those, and quite a lot of them, and lots of characters around at that time. And because it was so different then, because all the action was on the racecourse, there were no betting exchange or anything, so therefore the money all centred around the rails, and they used to be exciting days then when you were going to any sort of decent race meeting, and you'd have the likes of Dodger McCartney at the jumps, and he had an entourage of followers, Dirty Book Freddie and the Swan, and all these people that would follow Dodger around, and they were all strong punters in their own right. So there were an awful lot of characters around at that time. Some other trainers were quite clever. Guy that trained the sprinters down in Basingstoke, Holt, and it's not Holt, Les Hall. Les Hall trained down near Basingstoke. Very, very clever with sprinters. He was very good. So were a lot of the trainers. They set their stall out to back a winner or two along the way, and not all of them, but a lot of them were pretty cute.
So I need to know this, what would you do if somebody like Barney Curley or Michael Tabor came in? Would you off a stall and have it back plus some, or what? I mean,
Well, you try and lighten you try and lighten the burden. Probably I had staff, you know, that were. I was fortunate. I had some very good staff at the time. Gary Brown and Barry that worked for me. They were very cute. So they would be on their way before you know, before I even asked them. They were very good. But yeah, you try and lighten the blow. You try and lighten the liability, and also supposition. Say Barney's was second favourite, and he backed it. You would immediately try and get busy with the favourite, you know, and try and take everything else past them if you could. It didn't always. It sometimes proved easy to say, not so easy to do. But you got into a rhythm with it, really. If you're doing it on a daily basis, race by race, you got into a rhythm, and I was always happy to take a bit of a risk. And I know a lot of the bookies in the ring hated risk, really, but I didn't mind it. I thought it would make me take more money. So if I laid Barney, say they were 5,002 something or 5,001 something, I'd be aiming to try and take 6,000 on the race. So I might not succeed, but it would make me go forward into the race to try and take some more money, which is what I always wanted to do.
So sometimes you must have had some horrible wrong for a long period of time.
Because sometimes it can go wrong because there can be like follow through. It can start with a big punter having a big bet, but then there's other money for it from other quarters, and it can escalate, and you can fall into the soup quite easily. You normally tend to have the worst days in my big meetings when, you know, I remember one day at Ascot, and I bet on 5 races, I think it was the first 5. And I was losing about £32,000, a lot of money. Well, it's a lot of money now if you haven't got much, but then it was a lot more. I'm going back, I suppose, in the early 80s, I suppose. And there was a handicap, it was always called Ilda Sheep. It became the Ilda Sheeper. It became the subject of a celebrated court case, coincidentally. But it was in a handicap, and I think Guy Harwood trained it. Starkey definitely rode it, and it came tumbling in. It started out sort of favourite or joint favourite, but about 7-1 or something, 8-1, and it come right into about 7-2 in a big field of handicappers, and I stood it for a fortune, and it turned into the straight and he kicked it about four lengths clear, and it was definitely all over. And my pitch on the rails at Ascot was about, I'm looking directly across it about half a furlong out, and as I'm looking across at Ilda Sheep going for the line, it suddenly started to slew across the track. I'd never seen anything like it. It slewed across the track coming towards my pitch, and it slung Starkey off. And he came right under the rails. He finished up right under the rails, and obviously something else went on to win. So that was a relief, and that was a bad day without it winning.
But when you were the Sonic Binoculars, was it?
That was the one, yes. And then later, some years later, some people were arrested drug offences, and they said they used a sonic gun. So they were going to the races using a sonic gun. Well, because the only problem with that line of defence was it only ever happened once, so it didn't impress the judge, and I think they were convicted. But I can see Starkey laying under that ray. He was unhurt miraculously, but it was one of those things like Devon Lock and these things that are completely unexplained. And at the end of the day, you're dealing with animals, not machines. So, but that was a lucky let-off. But as I say, lucky let-off. It was still 30-odd thousand. The wrong way, so that was a bad. There were lots of them, you know, and the first year I ever made a book at the King George on the rails. That's I think they're a bad set of results generally for bookies that day. I think the King George day itself, is difficult for a bookie. I think the business will be good, the figures will be maybe a little bit better than usual, but the results are very difficult. And that was another bad day that sticks in my mind. But there's been a lot of them. So, but you have to learn to deal with it. Some people are better equipped handling risk. I'd like to think I'm not too bad at dealing with risk, and the same goes with the losses. I like to think I'm reasonably able to deal with the losses. I'm not saying anybody enjoys it, but it's a bit like being a jump jockey. You know you're going to get injured, and I think that I look at them and I cringe. I think how tough and brave are they, you know? And they sometimes, and I speak to them, think I must be mad, just standing horses for thousands of pounds. But there's no pain in that. You can soon get a couple of drinks and you'll forget all about it. But no, it's when it goes on relentless. From a bookie, I think most bookies will stand a bad day or two, but sometimes you can really hit bad losing runs that seem to go on for an eternity, and they want a bit of dealing with. Not least you've got to have the money to back it up. It's difficult. And of course, on the rails in those days, you used to have lots of credit accounts, and not everybody always paid, but the bookies always expected to pay immediately. So you can act in good faith and be the victim of it, because you can, on any given week you could have, say for argument's sake, you could have 50,000 to go out and 70,000-80,000 to come in, and your 50,000's got to go out, and then not necessarily the 70 or 80 doesn't come in, and you're left in an awkward position, So it's not, if there's credit involved in it, it's not as easy as it looks. Although, if I was advising someone today, I would say stick to cash, or at least race by race settlement. And that way you're at least always in charge of that side of the business. The accounting side of the business. You're not worried about bad debt, which was tended to be the bane of bookies, going back to those times. I think there was an awful lot of difference. There's an awful lot of difference between making a book then, when I did it, in that 25-year period, which I suppose would be, broadly speaking, 78 to 2003 or 4. A lot of difference then to now, because once the day that two major things, the buying and the selling of the pitches, was the lesser of the two. That made a difference, but it didn't make any near as big a difference as betting exchanges, which in effect removed the base of racecourse betting. They removed it from the racecourse up into cyberspace, and from that minute on, it was never going to be the same. So, along with that came electronics, which allowed untrained people to be bookmakers, because the machine could do the thinking for them. So for bookmakers like me, and others like me, hundreds like me, all their skills became semi-redundant overnight with the advent of electronics in betting, because all those skills of figures and knowing your figures and knowing how you were, what percentage you were betting to, and this sort of thing, it was all done by a machine. So really, somebody with half an hour's, or someone with a passing interest was almost as good as the experienced bookie, because of the electronics. So there has been a massive change, and the on-course business you see today really bears no resemblance to the one that I spent quite a long time operating in.